The secure line crackled through the marble halls of Mar-a-Lago at exactly 3:47 a.m. Donald Trump sat alone in his private study, the weight of America's unspoken crisis pressing against his chest like an immovable stone. Outside, the Florida palm swayed silently in the night breeze, but inside, the former president's hands trembled as he dialed a number that, if revealed, would have shocked the entire world. The encrypted satellite connection bridged continents, reaching into the heart of Burkina Faso, where a young leader had risen as Africa's most defiant voice. This was not a call between equals. It was desperation searching for strength. The irony was sharp. The man who once dismissed African nations was now turning to them for salvation. In the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was hunched over intelligence reports when his secure phone buzzed. The screen showed only scrambled digits, but his security chief whispered urgently, "Mon Capitaine, it's the Americans! It's him!" The night air was thick with the scent of shade trees and faint smoke from cooking fires beyond the compound walls. Traoré set down his pen. His military uniform remained crisp, his posture firm. Though it was late, he had been expecting this call. For weeks, his network had intercepted whispers of America's internal unraveling. His eyes, steady beneath the lamp's glow, betrayed nothing as he answered, "Mr. Trump." His voice was calm, the voice of a man who had stared down coups and foreign meddling. The line was crystal clear, every word cutting across oceans with stark precision. On the other end, Trump's breathing was heavy, burdened by what he was about to confess. "Captain," he began, voice cracking under the weight, "I need to speak with you. Not as politicians. Not for cameras. As leaders, facing something bigger than ourselves." The silence that followed was loaded, charged with history, with a reversal of centuries of power. Both men knew this moment would change how the world measured strength and vulnerability. Minutes ticked by as Trump laid bare a crisis that brute force could not fix. His voice wavered as he spoke of divisions tearing his country apart, of foreign powers he could not name aloud, of a need for wisdom beyond America's reach. Traoré listened in silence, fingers tapping lightly on his mahogany desk carved from local wood. Outside, Ouagadougou slept, save for the distant hum of night prayers echoing from a nearby mosque. When Trump finally stopped, the quiet was immense. Power had shifted, and both men knew it. "I will consider your words," Traoré replied at last. His tone betrayed nothing, but behind his eyes storms were gathering. He set the encrypted phone gently on his desk. The air felt heavier now, thick with the gravity of what had just taken place. America's most powerful man had pleaded with a 35-year-old African soldier for guidance. Through the window, the city lights of Ouagadougou glittered like scattered diamonds across the Sahel. His aide, Colonel Bombert, appeared silently in the doorway, reading the intensity in his captain's face. The irony was unbearable. The very nation that had sanctioned, pressured, and dismissed them now begged for salvation. Traoré's training demanded composure, yet the magnitude of the moment pressed against him. On the wall, portraits of Thomas Sankara and other African revolutionaries glowed in the lamplight, reminders of a legacy forged in defiance. "Mon Capitaine," Bombert whispered carefully, "the Americans have never shown such weakness before." Traoré paced the room, boots echoing softly against polished concrete. His gaze drifted to the compound gardens, where baobab trees stood like ancient guardians. The faint scent of millet fields mixed with the rhythm of distant drums. This was no ordinary call. It was a historic inversion of power, a reversal of centuries. He thought of his grandmother's stories, of gold stolen, of uranium taken, of generations betrayed. He could still hear her voice, frail but steady. "They take everything and leave us nothing." Now the embodiment of American dominance was asking Africa for help. Colonel Bombert placed a steaming cup of ginger tea on the desk. What will you tell him, Captain? Traore turned from the window. His eyes held both burden and opportunity. I will consult with the elders, he said at last. But first, I must know what kind of help they seek and what they are willing to give in return. Far away, in the shadows of Mar-a-Lago, Trump paced restlessly in his study. Classified papers were strewn across his desk, each one a grim picture of American decline. The threats were no longer external armies or bombs. They were within. Disinformation campaigns splintering society, hackers penetrating vital systems, corporations quietly abandoning the homeland, communities collapsing under despair. America's strength was crumbling not under attack, but under division. And Trump knew it. The old tools, military force, sanctions, diplomatic threats, were useless now. The reports were clear. Russia and China had studied African resistance movements for decades, learning the very tactics once used to defy colonialism. Community resilience, cultural unity, grassroots mobilization. Those strategies, once a shield for the oppressed, were now being turned against America. They are using our freedoms as weapons, Trump had told his advisers. But none could offer an answer that didn't risk destroying democracy itself. The bitter truth was inescapable. The salvation of America might depend on the very continent it once belittled. Nations like Burkina Faso had endured foreign exploitation, coups, and sabotage, yet had found ways to survive, to rebuild, to unify. Trump's analysts had quietly studied how Traore had done the impossible, uniting divided groups, restoring faith in broken institutions, carving out independence despite relentless pressure. He's achieved in 5 years what we've failed to achieve in 50, one CIA report admitted. But such truths never reached the public. And now, in the silence before dawn, America's fate seemed to rest in the hands of a young African captain who carried the spirit of Sankara and the weight of generations on his shoulders. Sophisticated counterintelligence networks had already exposed and neutralized foreign manipulation campaigns. While American social media fueled hatred and division, African communities built communication systems that strengthened bonds rather than tearing them apart. Trump realized, with a growing sense of dread, that Africa had become what America once claimed to be, a beacon of hope, resilience, and authentic democracy. The continent he had once dismissed as holes had quietly developed solutions to the very problems now tearing America apart. In the ancient meeting hall of Burkina Faso's presidential compound, the rustle of traditional robes filled the air as the nation's most respected elders gathered in the pre-dawn darkness. Traore had summoned them not through modern technology, but through the old ways, trusted messengers riding motorcycles across dusty village paths. The circular chamber, built from red clay bricks and adorned with mossy symbols, pulsed with ancestral gravity as weathered faces emerged from the shadows. Elder Mamadou, nearly 90 years old, his hands still bearing the memory of French colonial rule, took his seat at the carved wooden table. "My son," he said softly to Traore, "you have called us for something that will echo through 7 generations." The weight of survival, resistance, and hard-won independence settled over the room like morning mist over the Volta River. Elder Fatima, the only woman among them and guardian of oral traditions, leaned forward, her eyes sharp from decades of witnessing Western promises and betrayals. "Tell us, Captain," she asked, her voice flowing with the cadence of Delilah, "what makes the eagle come begging to the young lion?" Traore recounted Trump's desperate plea. The elders' faces shifted from shock to contemplation, and finally to something darker, grim satisfaction. They knew the irony well. The same America that had backed French exploitation of their uranium and gold was now seeking their wisdom. Elder Usman, once a teacher who had resisted colonial education, stroked his white beard. "The ancestors whispered this moment would come," he murmured, words heavy with prophecy. The discussion unfolded in the old tradition, each elder speaking truth without interruption, without judgment. Elder Borma, survivor of multiple coups and foreign interventions, reminded the Council of America's decades-long role in destabilizing African governments. "They taught us that unity was dangerous," he said, scarred hands gesturing toward portraits of Sankara and other martyrs. "But in trying to break us, they taught us where true strength lies." Elder Aminata spoke of her grandchildren studying abroad despite sanctions meant to isolate them. "Our young people grew strong because they had no choice," she said. "But American children have forgotten how to struggle together." Silence fell. The reversal of fortune was unmistakable. As the first rays of sun pierced the lattice windows, Elder Mamadou rose, his voice steady despite his years. "Captain, the question is not whether we can help America," he declared. "The question is whether helping them serves our people and the future of Africa." The council nodded, knowing this choice could redefine Africa's relationship with the West for generations. Traore felt the mantle of leadership heavier than ever, not just as president, but as guardian of African dignity. The elders' voices grew more personal. Mamadou's hands trembled as he spoke. "I was 7 when French soldiers stormed our village, demanding our strongest men for their wars in Indochina," he whispered. His words carried wounds that had never healed. Heads bowed in recognition. All had lived through similar scars. Fathers taken, resources stolen, traditions erased under colonial arrogance. Fatima recalled how French administrators had forced her mother to abandon traditional medicine, dismissing it as superstition. The chamber seemed alive with the ghosts of ancestors, demanding their sacrifices not be forgotten. "And now," Mamadou said bitterly, "the child of that same system comes seeking our wisdom." The conversation shifted to more recent betrayals. Elder Usman spoke of structural adjustment programs that had crippled Africa in the 1980s and 90s, Western institutions forcing privatization, cutting subsidies, dismantling industries in the name of aid. "They called it development," he spat, "but it was economic colonialism dressed in finer words." Elder Borma added his scars. American companies extracting millions of tons of uranium, while Burkinabe children lacked schools and hospitals. These were not distant memories. They were living wounds. Yet, through the bitterness, another current emerged: survival, resistance, victory. Elder Aminata reminded them that every colonial power had eventually fallen, not through battles, but through the stubborn resilience of ordinary people. "Our grandmothers taught us," she said, pointing toward the towering baobab tree outside, "that the tree survives because it bends, but never breaks." The French had gone. The policies had failed. And Africa had endured, stronger for it. Elder Fatima rose at last. Her voice cut through the hall like steel. "We owe America nothing," she declared. "But we owe our children everything. A future where African wisdom is respected. Where our resources serve us first. Where our voices shape the world." Murmurs of agreement filled the room. They knew this was more than diplomacy. It was a rewriting of history. Traore felt the eyes of ancestors on him. His response would either repeat cycles of exploitation or forge a new path of respect. Later, across continents, the secure video call flickered to life. Trump appeared in Mar-a-Lago, surrounded by gilded decor and American flags. Traore sat in his modest office, decorated with African art and portraits of liberation heroes. The contrast was striking. One man born into wealth, hardened by privilege. The other forged by struggle, carrying the collective burden of his people. Yet in that moment, both bore the weight of nations. Trump's desperation seeped through the screen. His trademark bravado was gone. What remained was a man stripped bare, seeking answers he no longer possessed. "Captain," Trump's voice faltered, softer than ever. "All my life, I believed America had the answers. But watching what you built in Burkina Faso—" His words trailed off, choked by an admission that defied his pride. Traore studied him quietly, eyes sharp, steady. He had seen this before, the breaking of men who thought power was permanent. He said nothing, letting the silence speak louder than judgment. The young African leader understood. History was turning. French officials, World Bank representatives, UN envoys, all had been forced to confront the limits of their assumed superiority when faced with African resilience and innovation. "You've united your people while ours tear each other apart," Trump admitted. "You've built independence while we've become dependent on the very systems we once created." The irony hung in the air, heavy, like a bridge neither man expected to cross. What shocked them both was the birth of genuine respect despite their vastly different worlds. Trump began to understand that Traore's strength did not come from inherited privilege, but from an authentic bond with his people's pain, struggle, and hope. For too long, the American had confused compliance with loyalty, wealth with wisdom. Here, however, stood a leader who commanded devotion through service, not self-interest. And Traore, for his part, recognized something hidden beneath Trump's bluster. A man deeply afraid of failing his people, however questionable his motives might be. "You fear losing what you inherited," Traore observed carefully, "while I fight each day to protect what we built for nothing." The difference was critical. One man clung to a fading legacy. The other built a living one through sacrifice and collective struggle. As the conversation deepened, both men realized they were living through a historic shift. Trump's appeal to a young African captain was more than desperation. It symbolized the collapse of Western monopoly on global solutions and the rise of new centers of wisdom. Traore knew his response would echo beyond Burkina Faso. It could ignite a continental awakening. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "this crisis is teaching us both what true strength really means." The possibility of alliance between such unlikely partners shimmered with the potential to upend international relations, breaking the old patterns of dominance and exploitation. For the first time, both men glimpsed a future where cooperation might replace control. At dawn, the compound filled with long shadows as Traore prepared his response. His advisors had worked through the night with economists, security chiefs, and legal scholars. They were not drafting a negotiation. They were drafting terms that could reorder the world. Colonel Bambara placed a leather-bound folder before his captain. "These are not negotiations, mon capitaine. These are the terms of a new world order." Traore nodded. He knew the conditions would either lift Africa into equal partnership or reveal the West's refusal to change. The first condition, economic justice. America would end policies that kept Africa dependent on Western institutions. No more forced agreements that trapped African nations into exporting raw materials while importing overpriced goods. Traore demanded a $50 billion African Development Fund, managed only by Africans, to fuel industry, technology, and education. American corporations would reinvest 60% of their profits locally, building jobs, infrastructure, and futures, not just draining wealth. "No more charity," Traore had told his advisors. "We want partnership, mutual benefit. The days of Africa as a resource mine begging for aid are finished." The second condition, political sovereignty. America would recognize Africa's right to self-determination, free from sanctions or engineered regime changes. No more interference. No more using global institutions as weapons. Any American military presence would fall under African oversight, serving African security, not Western agendas. Most boldly, Traore demanded African seats with veto power on the UN Security Council. "We will no longer accept being subjects in decisions that shape our destiny," he declared to his council. The third condition was revolutionary, knowledge and respect. America would acknowledge Africa not as a recipient of aid, but as a source of solutions. Partnerships would be equal, with knowledge flowing both ways. American universities would teach African history, philosophy, and political thought as core curricula. African scholars would gain full access to American research funding and facilities. They need our solutions more than we need their charity, Traore told Trump in a follow-up call. By dawn in Europe, the story had broken. At 6:47 a.m., a junior staffer at the Élysée Palace mistakenly forwarded a confidential memo to a journalist. Within minutes, the world saw the headline: Trump secretly seeks help from Burkina Faso's Traore. In Paris, President Macron hurled his coffee cup against the wall. He knew at once. France's neo-colonial grip on West Africa had suffered a fatal wound. In London, aid scrambled to Downing Street. Across the EU, ministers gathered in panic. How had their former colony become more influential than the entire European bloc? The shockwaves rippled further. In Beijing, Xi Jinping's advisors quietly celebrated, noting that America's desperate appeal validated China's South alliances. In Moscow, officials toasted quietly, calling it proof that U.S. hegemony was collapsing. The irony was exquisite. The very African nations once dismissed were now approached as saviors. Markets convulsed. Traders watched in disbelief as the West African CFA franc strengthened against the U.S. dollar for the first time in history. From Lagos to Nairobi to Accra, people poured into the streets. Radios blared the news, televisions replayed the headlines, and ordinary Africans laughed and wept. For decades, they had been told to aspire to Western validation. Now, the West was coming to them. Nigeria's President Tinubu called an emergency cabinet meeting. Kenya's president immediately offered support to Traore. South Africa spoke openly of a new dawn for BRICS and African independence. Social media across the continent exploded. Memes, songs, slogans, and tears filled the digital air. Youth who had grown up with Western rejection finally saw their leaders set the global agenda. Even the Vatican issued a careful statement calling for dialogue. The UN Secretary-General urged respectful cooperation. But the truth was undeniable. The balance of power had shifted. Global media struggled to spin it. Western outlets dismissed it as symbolic. But soon even they were forced to admit something seismic had occurred. For the first time in centuries, the world was turning toward Africa, not out of pity, but out of necessity. As dusk settled over Ouagadougou, the ancient baobab cast its shadow across the courtyard where history was being written. Traore sat with measured composure, Trump across from him, waiting in uncharacteristic silence. The world seemed to hold its breath. Mr. President, Traore began, his tone steady, his words deliberate. Burkina Faso will help America, but not as a junior partner grateful for recognition. These are the terms of a new era. He laid them out with unflinching clarity. Immediate economic justice for African nations, true political sovereignty free from Western interference, and recognition of Africa not as a recipient of aid, but as a source of wisdom and innovation. These are not punishments, Traore explained. They are investments in a world where cooperation replaces exploitation. The weight of centuries hung in the air. Trump listened quietly, realizing that this was no ordinary negotiation. It was a demand for transformation, an end to the old order. When Traore finally extended his hand across the table, the gesture carried more power than any treaty. It was Africa declaring equality, dignity, and leadership. Trump hesitated only for a heartbeat before grasping it. "We have a deal," he said simply. Relief mingled with the shock of knowing he had just accepted terms that would shake the foundations of American foreign policy. Outside the palace walls, word of the agreement swept through Ouagadougou. Crowds erupted in celebration. not just for their president's victory, but for Africa's emergence as an equal partner in shaping the world. The ripples spread quickly. African markets soared, Western corporations scrambled to adjust, and leaders across the continent prepared to renegotiate their place in the global order. The age of Western dominance was ending, not with guns or armies, but with the quiet strength of African resolve. In that moment, Captain Ibrahim Traoré proved that leadership is not inherited, it is earned through service, sacrifice, and vision. The youngest leader in Africa had redefined global power, and the world would never be the same again. What do you think of this unprecedented alliance? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe my channel.